Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Willis Unscripted. As always, I'm your host, Sarah Willis, and today I was wanting to do something a little different, something a little new, a little fresh, and so I am starting kind of a new little fun series called Let Me Explain Something. So my camera's tracking my face, so it's a phrase that I say so much in my fifth period classroom that I actually had the shirt made. Much to the amusement, I hope, of my students. But yes, I had no idea how much I was saying it until I had a couple of students fill in the next part of what I was going to say, which was, let me explain something. So yeah, I thought that might be kind of a fun series to do with the Willis Unscripted podcast. So let me explain something. So this is a little bit of a scripted. I wanted to do some research on some fun things. And the first thing that came to my mind is why we talk to ourselves. So let me explain something. If you've ever gone through your house or, paced around somewhere saying, okay, keys, wallet, phone, you're saying all these things out loud, right? Or maybe you've been driving somewhere and suddenly say, why did I do that? I totally missed my turn. Oh my gosh, so stupid. We talk to ourselves, right? Congratulations, you're normal. So you're not crazy. The only thing would be maybe if you have a voice in your head that answers back and multiple voices, maybe then we need to have a conversation. But yeah, it's a totally normal thing to talk to yourself. So don't worry about that. In fact, psychologists say most people have conversations with themselves almost constantly. And sometimes those conversations are out loud. But most of the time, it happens silently in your head. Maybe you're replaying a conversation from earlier in the day, or maybe you're imagining what you're going to say tomorrow at a very important meeting, or maybe you have a difficult conversation you got to have with a friend, or your boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever it may be. And maybe you're even debating whether you should send that text. Maybe you're rewriting it in your head. You're thinking about how they might hear it or perceive it before you hit send, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just send that text and you don't think about it. I sometimes wish I had that kind of gumption, but I overthink a lot of things. So, but sometimes it's really, for me at least, and maybe for you, our brain is hosting a full panel discussion. Like I am having different, counterpoints, arguments getting brought up in my head of, well, you should do this. No, you probably shouldn't do this. You should do X, Y, Z. And maybe another version of you responds. And maybe you're somewhere in the middle trying to figure it all out, what the right answer is. Should you do X or should you do Y? And so today I wanted to explain that. I wanted to explain talking to yourself and how it's a normal part of how our human minds and brains work, and why the conversations you have with yourself matter a lot more than you think. And so first, what's the voice in your head, right? So the voice in your head is something that psychologists would call that inner dialogue, right? So it's that voice in your head that is maybe narrating life as it happens. Maybe you're hearing something in your head that's like, okay, what am I supposed to be doing right now? Or why did I come here? Or yeah, that probably sounded weird. Right. And so psychologists will give out estimates of maybe between 20 and 50% of our waking thoughts happen as internal dialogue. So that means a huge part of our mental life, what's going on up here, is basically having a conversation with yourself. Right. And so sometimes it's very quick. Sometimes it's very practical. Like, don't forget the keys. Don't forget the milk. Grab your keys. Do X before it's, too late. But sometimes it's very reflective. Maybe it's, did I sound weird? Was that weird? Did she sound weird? Ooh, should I have said that? Those sorts of things, right? It's reflective. And sometimes it's just full-blown mental storytelling. It's, maybe you're replaying something that happened earlier, and except this time you finally have a comeback. I know what I should have said. Like, that was 12 years ago, Sam, you need to move on. But, I think you understand what I'm talking about here, right? But those inner thoughts, right? 20 to 50% of your waking life being internal dialogue, that's huge. So if you're having those kinds of conversations, whether it's, those practical don't forget things, or it's reflective, you're not alone. And so sometimes, most of the time, that conversation stays in your head, right? But occasionally it escapes. And suddenly you're standing in the kitchen, maybe saying like, oh gosh, I forgot the milk, darn it, you know. Or you could, if I'm, walking around, I may say like, darn it, why did you do that? Something, maybe not the PG version, but yeah, right? You may have a thought that you express out loud, especially maybe if it's in frustration. I constantly, if I'm losing something, which is not often, I don't lose things often. And in the family, I proudly proclaim I am the Hufflepuff. I can find just about anything. It is true. It is rather mystical powers. You can ask some of my friends about that. I can find car keys when no one else can. Anyway, it's a long story. Perhaps I can tell you all about it later, but now's not the time. But all this is to say that research shows that thinking out loud actually can help your brain focus. And so a study from the University of Wisconsin, there's been many, but this particular study tested this in a really simple way. Participants were asked to search for specific objects in a room, and some people stayed silent and others repeated the object that they're wanting to find, right? So maybe it's like banana, 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 banana. Like you're looking and it's, like you're priming, your brain. And the people who said the word of the thing they were looking for, they found it faster. So why, right? So it's because speaking activates more areas of the brain than just thinking alone. So you're engaging your language center, you're engaging the auditory process and memory all at once, right? And so when you're walking through your house saying keys, phone, wallet, whatever it is that you can't leave the house without, your brain is basically trying to help itself remember where you put something, or, so you're not losing it. You're optimizing, your brain. So you're not going crazy if you're saying things out loud. It really is your brain's way of getting everything involved in the search than just using your eyes and being silent, right? It's you're trying to get everything involved. And that's very practical. It's very great. But what about those conversations that we have with ourselves when it's not necessarily practical? And I don't want to say not practical, but not looking for something tangible. Well, honestly, the most important and interesting self-talk does happen a lot silently, which are those imaginary conversations that we have in our head. So you might be driving home, you might be in the lunch line, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, if Susan brings this up again, this is what I'm going to say. This is exactly how I'm going to respond. I know what I'm going to do. Or maybe you're preparing for a meeting tomorrow and mentally you're rehearsing what you're going to say. Or maybe someone said something slightly strange earlier and now your brain is trying to figure out what it meant. What was that sarcasm? Was she serious? What does it mean? And so you're basically, in these kinds of imaginary conversations, you're running simulations. And psychologists do believe that internal dialogue like this helps us practice social situations, before they happen. It's this mental rehearsal. There's a lot of that even with storytelling, right? I don't have time to branch out into that, but those imaginary situations that we read about kind of help us rehearse what might happen in our lives and how we might respond. So same thing with this internal dialogue, essentially, right? We're rehearsing what's going to happen. We're priming for that ideal outcome. And so that explains why sometimes you finish an imaginary argument in your head and feeling oddly satisfied, right? Even though the person wasn't actually there, it's like, okay, I got that off my chest. And so if it does happen, I know what I'm going to say. And kids actually do this all the time. One reason why adults might find self-talk as weird is because we do associate it with children. Because again, they do this constantly. And there was a developmental psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, Vygotsky. So we're just going to call him Lev. So he studied this and he discovered something really kind of cool, which was when kids start learning new skills, they narrate what they're doing. And, you may hear something like, oh, wait, no, it goes here. No, over here. It goes here. And that's called private speech. And that's one of the ways kids learn. I see this all the time. If I'm helping with a kids class in jiu-jitsu or some kind of a sport, I will sometimes hear children out loud saying, okay, left hand, right hand, pull. And I'll even do that too when I'm rehearsing a new technique. I will narrate what I'm doing. And I find I learn it better if I'm narrating it. And it's a big way kids learn. They use language to kind of guide their behavior and kind of ingrain it. And as we get older, a lot of the time that speech moves inside of our heads, but the process, it's still there. And so if you're somebody who's more of an auditory learner or someone who remembers almost everything she ever hears, which is it's not great all the time. But when I say things out loud, I'm actually able to remember it better. That's why I was always in school. If we had a discussion on something, it was in my brain forever. But if it was something I just had to read, yeah, I could remember it. I'm not, it's not like I read like, what are these? It's, I just was always able to remember it if we had some kind of a conversation, which is why I learn really great by listening to things. So some kids are that way. I'm certainly that way. And I know that speaking things out loud and problem solving out loud is a better way for some people to process just inherently. And so that's, it's mental coaching, but it's like you're coaching yourself, right? And athletes, again, just kind of piggyback on this, athletes also can be trained to do very intentional self-talk. What do I mean by that? Now, this is something very powerful and it was really great for me when I worked with Erin Hurley. You got to look her up. She's a sports psychologist. But when I would want to go and compete, the mental aspect of jiu-jitsu or any sport, it's huge. We train our bodies all the time to be the best, but sometimes that mental aspect isn't there. And for me, it was this self-talk that if something went really bad, I would have a negative train of thought or a negative self-talk spiral. And yeah, that has a major impact on your performance. So our self-talk, even as athletes, matters immensely. And so sports psychology research has shown that deliberate self-talk improves focus, confidence, and performance. And I know this firsthand. I've been through it. I've been through the sports psychology coaching and understanding the value of self-talk. And so you may hear an athlete whispering, stay calm, stay focused, or, it could be, something like for me, you want this, you've prepared for this. It's whatever the phrase may be, they've trained that phrase so that they know how to prime their brain for the best performance possible. And it's giving your brain instructions, so it could be that they talk about, okay, grab here, do this, plant your foot here, whatever it may be. But your brain is actively responding to the words that you say. Now, it may be out loud, it may be whispered, it may just be that you're shouting it really loud in your head. That's kind of what I have to do when I'm, rolling. But even if you're saying them to yourself and you know that you're the one saying them, still intentionally really driving into that positive self-talk or that self-talk in general, really being intentional with it can get really great results. Now, it doesn't replace the actual training of the actual sport that you're doing, but it allows your brain to be the best optimized and put in the best possible position to achieve your goal, which is presumably to win, right? So you can't ignore your inner voice or your inner dialogue because as an athlete, because it's either going to be your biggest critic or your best coach, right? It can either be the biggest hindrance for your performance or the thing that propels you to the next level. And so talking to yourself also with that concept, it helps you think. So, self-talk is something related to what we call metacognition. So it really, all that metacognition, all that means is really just thinking about your thinking. So you may say something like, okay, what am I actually doing here? Or, maybe you step out. So essentially what you're doing, if you say something like that, is you're stepping outside of your immediate reaction and you're examining it, and so your brain is slipping into kind of two roles, right? It's one part is experiencing the moment, and then the other part becomes the observer of the moment. And so this inner dialogue really does help us, solve problems, reflect on experiences, maybe relegate our emotions, and, even make the best decision possible. So in other words, the conversations that you have with yourself, thinking about your thinking, it really shows how humans are able to process and think deeply on a lot of different options and a lot of different things. That's why, things, why did you feel that way? Can you think about how and why you could have, responded that way? How could we improve? That's metacognition. And so it's in getting, I don't know, maybe I'm too far off base, but the fact that our brains can do that is what makes therapy so powerful and such a great tool if you need help relegating your emotions. And, it's on that, it's just so fascinating that the words that we say to ourselves can actually influence how we perceive things, how we process things. I know I've been in a lot of situations where I will stop and say, okay, Sarah, relax. And, it's not going to solve the problem immediately, but it does create some psychological distance between me and the problem, or it can help me possibly see it as advice from another person in a way if I'm creating that kind of distance. And it makes it easier, if you're able to talk to yourself and relegate your emotions with the correct and right kind of self-talk. It does help you calm down and think clearer. And so it could be something as simple as saying, all right, you've got this, it may not be going great right now, but you've prepared, you know what to do. So let's try this, and the voice, ultimately, it's not going to fix things. It can certainly make things worse, but the voice in your head does matter, right? And because the voice, essentially becomes the narrator of your life in many ways. It's, some people walk all around, all day, walk all around with an internal voice saying, gosh, that's embarrassing. Man, I should have done better. Man, I messed up. Man, gosh, I'm an idiot. And you can extrapolate whatever crazy phrase you want to throw in there that's not necessarily PG. But because that's so internal, it feels almost to our brains that it must be true, right? And our brain will take that almost as like it's instructions. And okay, well, it must be true that I suck. It must be true that I don't matter. I don't X, Y, Z, whatever it is. And so literally the tone of the voice in our heads will shape how we experience things. And, so it's a supportive voice in your head. If you are very intentional about your self-talk that you engage in, it could build confidence and it may help you process things in a healthy way. Or a critical one, maybe an overly critical one that doesn't give you any kind of grace whatsoever. That's going to build anxiety. It's going to, cause you to fester negative emotions and, just live in stress and negativity. Now, I'm not saying positive thinking solves everything, but I have seen in my own life just the power of how we perceive an event, not, being toxically positive or something like that, but having a sense of gratitude and a sense of somewhat optimism or choosing joy in a way. It does change how you experience trauma, or not necessarily trauma, but difficulties in life, right? But if you're someone who, I hate this word, but I love this word too. If you allow negativity to fester, it's a nasty word because it's a nasty outcome. It's going to be a much more difficult experience of life and reality. So all this to say, I try to keep these little let me explain things short and simple. This is obviously not going to explain everything, but it's just me trying to explain something. So if you've ever caught yourself, talking to yourself, you're not alone, you're not crazy. But self-talk is really, really important. How it helps us, prime our actions in the world for whatever it may be, finding things or helping us understand situations or understanding emotions. So don't feel like you're crazy. It's perfectly normal. Just, if the voices are telling you to do something really bad, yeah, go get help, go get therapy. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't want you to think that you're crazy. You're perfectly not crazy. So, But yes, so this was our first little foray into Let Me Explain Something. Hope you enjoyed it. It's really short, but yes, so hopefully y'all like it. Comment down below. Maybe something else you want me to explain in a short way, not obviously an exhaustive way, because we could be here for hours. So, but yes, hope you have a great day or night whenever you're watching this, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.